Okay, so after Canelo getting dominated by Terrence Crawford, there has been some rumours of a potential rematch here between, management and agents and articles that have been put out there and reports that have been published. And looking at it, and even though people on X, saying Canelo wants that rematch, could that rematch happen? It doesn't sit well with me, I think, because this rematch for Canelo makes no sense if you're looking at it purely from a sporting point of view, right? Canelo offered Crawford next to no problems for 12 rounds. I gave Canelo 2 rounds. If you're generous, you give him four. Either way, it was, a very easy fight for Crawford where, like I said, Canelo wasn't really able to cause him any problems at all. Now, is it somewhat understandable Canelo wanting that rematch for unsporting reasons such as the commercial potential there? Of course. Of course, that's an option. Of course, that's probably the reason, to be honest, because there isn't really any other huge money fights for Canelo other than that Crawford fight rematch, right? He could rematch Bivol. That's not necessarily a money fight like the way a Crawford rematch is. He could fight the bigger Charlo at 168. But again, none of these fights are as big as Terrence Crawford. Right? None of these fights are as big as Terrence Crawford. And again, if Canelo wants this fight purely for commercial gain, which is probably a reason why, a lot of boxers fight. A lot. And there's nothing wrong with that inherently. Of course, all boxers fight for money. Of course. But I think it doesn't sit well with, the fan bases because at that point it feels like your intentions aren't pure anymore. At the time this fight gets announced and even going into this fight, Canelo's taking this fight not because he thinks it's an easy fight at all. But he's doing this because if you want to go down as a great in the sport of boxing, these are the things you have to do. Right? Every once in a generation, once in a career, opportunities like this present themselves. And if you think you're the fighter you think you are, if you want to be the fighter you think you are, you accept those fights. You take those fights. You go into them head on, right? So I understand Canelo taking the first fight. But for him to do a rematch when the stage of Canelo's career where he's at now, it's not like he can change who he is as a boxer. Now, there could be some stylistic gameplay changes that Canelo could have made, which would lend to him in a rematch. There are some changes to game plan, maybe working the jab a bit more. Maybe not leading with a lead hook to the body against a southpaw. A quick southpaw who can counter you when you open yourself up like that. Maybe doing stuff like that might help. But is Canelo going to overnight become, or over the course of one training camp, I suppose, become this super slick, switch hitting, outside boxer at this point of his career? No, he's not going to change who Canelo is. Canelo is who Canelo is at this point, right? So expect some minor changes if it was to change, if the rematch was to happen. But ultimately, it would be the same fight because they are the same two boxers and they offer the same problems to solutions. Do you know what I mean? Nothing would have really changed, is my point. But yeah, I would be surprised if that fight gets made. Deep down, Canelo probably doesn't want it. Deep down. Because he knows, yeah, it's a huge payday. But he's been rich. He's been paid from boxing. He's been, for the better part of the last decade, he's been doing stadium shows. One of the biggest names in the sport of boxing. Been one of those names, bro. Canelo's been there. So, okay, yeah, say he rematches Crawford another 100 mil. I get it. In terms of leverage, it does feel like that makes a lot of sense. Train 12 weeks and have a fight, and you get 100 mil at the end of it. Like, that's a trade a lot of us would do in that same situation, right? Obviously. But yeah, I don't think that fight happened, largely because of how dominant it was for Crawford. And like I said, it just wouldn't fit right with the fan base. And of course, naturally, if that fight gets made and doesn't sit right with the fan base, it's not as much of a money fight because you're not going to get as many views on Netflix. You're not going to get the same amount of pay-per-view sales if it's depending on what platform they do it on. Do you know what I mean? It's not because the first fight was so dominant. It would be like Manny Pacquiao called him for a rematch after Floyd. After Floyd pretty much dog walked him for 12 rounds, and he offered next to no resistance. I suppose in Manny's situation, he was saying he had an injury. Forget what it was. His left shoulder, did he say it was? So he had that excuse built in. Canelo had no excuses. Canelo had no injuries. Right? And even that rematch didn't even happen. Never say never, by the way, because both guys are semi active. Because Floyd's fighting again. Floyd's fighting Mike Tyson. Christ, I need to make a video about that. Floyd's fighting Mike Tyson, and Manny Pacquiao's actually damn near fighting for world titles at welterweight now. Well, his last fight was a world title fight, which is crazy, bro. It's so crazy, but what can you do, man? That's the way boxing is. I don't think Canelo v Crawford 2 is going to happen, but I'd be super curious to know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you think this rematch could be made? And if it does, who wins?